God, and with God, his organs. For you can tie me up if you wish, but there is nothing more useless than an organ. When you will have made him a body without organs, then you will have delivered him from his automatic reactions and restored him to his true freedom. The literary clinic, then, has two interlocking components, which the remainder of this paper will outline. A semiotic concern with the genesis of literature as a distinct form of language use, and a political concern with the collective life of the social and cultural body. This dual concern is demonstrated in Deleuze's reading of Samuel Beckett. Beckett's work is frequently characterized by obsessive repetitions. In a famous scene from the novel Malloy, the narrator seeks to distribute pebbles he's gathered from the beach among his various pockets in order to suck each one consecutively an even number of times. Quote, I had, say, 16 stones, 4 in each of my 4 pockets, these being the 2 pockets of my trousers and the 2 pockets of my greatcoat. Taking a stone from the right pocket of my greatcoat and putting it in my mouth, I replaced it in the right pocket of my greatcoat by a stone from the right pocket of my trousers, which I replaced by a stone from the left pocket of my trousers, which I replaced by a stone from the left pocket of my greatcoat, which I replaced by the stone which was in my mouth, as soon as I had finished sucking it. Thus, there were still 4 stones in each of my 4 pockets, but not quite the same stones. And when the desire to suck took hold of me again, I drew again on my right pocket of my greatcoat, certain of not taking the same stone as the last time, and while I sucked it, I rearranged the other stones in the way I have just described. And it goes on like that for several pages. Chap McGarren does it far better than I do. Using the resources of the literary clinic, we can ask what is going on in this strange but strangely fascinating passage. We have at first glance an apparently pathological desire to suck stones in a manner that we can call obsessional. The link to Beckett's personal biography here can easily be made. He was a prolific self-diagnostician, describing himself in his diary as an obsessional neurotic. Indeed, his careful cataloguing of symptoms and complexes are reminiscent of the obsessional constructions of his characters. However, Beckett's writing is clearly much more than a simple catharsis or personal confession. It emerges from a remarkable capacity to capture and marshal obsessional desire in creative language, to transform the unproductive repetitions of pathology into a productive strategy, re-engineering the behaviour in order to extract something new from it. Secondly, we can say that Beckett's text exhibits a kind of extreme formalism, a hyper-rational tendency to exhaust the different permutations possible in any given situation. Deleuze argues that exhaustion, in this Beckettian sense, goes beyond mere tiredness. When we're tired, we're no longer capable of realizing the possible actions open to us. We can articulate what we would like to do, but we're too tired to actually do it. Exhaustion, on the other hand, forces us to the very limits of language, and therefore to the very limits of the possible. As Deleuze put it, the tired person can no longer realize, but the exhausted person can no longer possibilize. Beckett's characters are such exhausted people. Deleuze contends that Beckett's works give us a remarkable portrait of exhaustion as a distinctly modern condition. Quote, only an exhausted person can exhaust the possible, because he has renounced all need, preference, goal, or signification. Only the exhausted person is sufficiently disinterested, sufficiently scrupulous. Indeed, he is obliged to replace his plans with tables and programs that are devoid of all meaning. Beckett's great contribution to logic is to have shown that exhaustivity, does not occur without a certain physiological exhaustion, somewhat as Nietzsche showed that the scientific ideal is not attained without a kind of vital degeneration. It is only with the rationalization, It is only with the rationalization and formalization of life, the exhaustive abstraction of desire through tables and programs devoid of meaning, that exhaustion becomes a physiological reality. Beckett's self-diagnoses then can be said to diagnose a condition of modern subjectivity more generally. Deleuze is thus careful to avoid any simple biographical conceptualization of the link between the sufferings of an author's personal life and his or her writings. This, for me at least, is the real originality of the literary clinic. what takes it beyond the realms of psychoanalytic or biographical criticism. The author, Deleuze insists, is the physician of himself, but only because he is first and foremost a physician of the world. The author makes use of illness to diagnose, to deduce something, not simply in herself, but in the broader world. Every illness is a kind of blockage, the inhibition of a life process, and a symptom is the sign of such a blockage, a materialization of it in the body. But when an author performs a self-diagnosis, what is thereby diagnosed leads far beyond the individual body or the individual psychology of the author. In other words, symptoms are capable of providing an index for other kinds of blockages, other kinds of repressions. The authorial body then becomes a kind of map or diagram of the social and political body. This is why in his book on Masoch, Deleuze criticizes the tendency of psychoanalytic commentaries to focus primarily on the libidinal or psychosexual content of Masoch's writing, namely the famous pleasure-pain complex, whereby the masochist derives enjoyment from being whipped, beaten, humiliated, and so forth. Deleuze asks if this is really the important aspect of Masoch's work. While there is no doubt that Masoch himself enjoyed being whipped, beaten, etc., his work points us towards something else, some more general observation about the nature of subjectivity and power. Throughout Masoch's life and novels, there are many legal and jurisprudential themes. In 1869, he wrote the following contract, formally sealing his relationship to his lover, Fanny Pister. Herr Leopold von Secher-Masoch agrees on his word of honor to be the slave of Frau von Pister and unconditionally fulfill her every wish and every order for a period of 6 months. Fanny Pister, in return, promises to wear fur as often as practical, and especially when being cruel. This contract is confirmed by the signatures of the participants. This contractually bound relationship would go on to form the plot of Masoch's most famous novel, Venus in Furs, in which a man enslaves himself by means of a contract to a mistress who treats him in ever more degrading ways. Deleuze insists that the highly formal language of the contract, and not the psychosexual content of the masochist's pleasure-pain complex, is the real essence of the masochistic universe. What the masochist provides is a kind of parody of legal obligation. By submitting to the law with such a passionate diligence, he unlocks and tastes its forbidden contents, finding liberation through the pure semiotic form of the law itself. The law becomes the rule of its own perversion. What Deleuze argues then is that Masoch's work provides us with an exemplary diagnosis of the paradox of the modern formalistic conception of legality. The law in its modern form is ultimately empty of content, since its validity is determined by reference solely to how it's applied, its procedural conventionality, and not the nature of the kinds of activities it's applied to. In other words, the law can have no content that is necessarily against the law. But if the law is arbitrary in this way, then how can it be said to be necessarily or essentially prohibiting? Could it not become a source of enjoyment and a medium of liberation? Deleuze suggests that Masoch diagnoses not simply or primarily the perversion of the masochist, but the slavishness of the rest of us, our secret enjoyment of the law, and our consequent inability to move beyond the impasses of modernity. The figure of the masochistic hero, then, can be read as a kind of utopian figure of rebirth and renewal, the sign of a future reconfiguration of language and desire. The literary clinic, then, presents us with two different languages of the body, two ways in which language mediates our relationship to bodily materiality. On the one hand, there is the austere formalism of Beckett's obsessional lists and Masoch's legal contracts. These are, as Deleuze puts it, tables and programs devoid of meaning. On the other hand, there is Woolf's inarticulate lump of pure sound that coagulates around a trauma, whose essence is unspeakable and unformalizable. There is the formal edifice of the text, but also a language of silence and suffering, a language of pure form, and a language made up solely of an unformalizable materiality. There are thus two distinct forms of encountering language through the body. At one end of the spectrum, we have the completely objectified forms, which allow us to create a distance from the body, to hover over the body, and to judge it. The obsessional characters of Beckett's work demonstrate what it means to find oneself trapped by value judgments so objectively binding and precise that they become empty forms devoid of meaning. Similarly, Massock's love contracts were designed to expunge all tenderness and affection from his relationships in order to enjoy the cruelty of a law without content. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the inescapability of the inarticulate, whose ultimate figure is a kind of vast, undifferentiated abyss or desert in which all significations are dissolved. When Artaud appeals to a body without organs, this is the kind of body he's invoking. But here too we witness a loss of meaning. From the perspective of the abyssal body, all meaning is experienced as tormenting. Language tends to take on a threatening and menacing aspect, as if words themselves were concrete things capable of sailing the body like missiles. The American schizophrenic author Lewis Wolfson experienced language in precisely this way. Wolfson experienced the sound of the English language, especially when spoken by one of his parents, as a kind of physical torment. And the only respite he was able to find was in translating the offending words of his mother tongue into foreign words with similar sounds and meaning. So, for example, he would take an English word that caused him pain, such as lady, and he would translate it into the German word Leute, meaning people or folk. It was only through this system of translation that he was able to bear to live amongst English speakers. And he wrote several books of what we can only call schizolinguistics using this method. So Deleuze's phenomenology of language then revolves around two poles or two extremes of a rigid objectivity and a subjective abyss, both testifying to a type of bodily suffering manifested in an encounter with language. The literary clinic, I argue, offers us a way of analysing how literature tends to navigate a course between these two extremes. This is the key point which links Deleuze's formalist concern with the nature of literary language to his political concern with the construction of bodily experience. The two dangers of the undifferentiated abyssal body and the objectified, formalized body are the political coordinates, which allow the author to map out the collective social body via the semiotics of his or her own particular becomings. Deleuze's famous collaborations with the psychoanalyst Félix Guattari follow this very same logic. Deleuze and Guattari write that their conception of political philosophy, what they call schizoanalysis, provides us with a, quote, universal clinical theory of the social body. This clinical politics, or politics of symptoms, is clarified and elaborated by Deleuze and Guattari in their book on Kafka. Kafka is an exemplary figure because his work dissolves that boundary between the individual and the collective body. Particular emphasis is placed on Kafka's decision to shun both Yiddish and Czech, and to choose German as the language of his writing. The German of Kafka's Prague was the language of officialdom and bureaucracy, what Deleuze and Guattari describe as withered, abstinent, rigid, and dried up. Unlike his contemporaries of the Prague school, Kafka chose not to romantically embellish this language in an attempt to give it a relationship to a living context, but on the contrary, to push its linguistic poverty, its detachment from everyday life as far as it would go, as Deleuze and Guattari put it. Kafka will make language cry with an extremely sober and rigorous cry. He will pull from it the barking of the dog, the cough of the ape, and the bustling of the beetle. He will turn syntax into a cry that will embrace the rigid syntax of this dried up German. Kafka's writing thus proceeds from a creative appropriation of a paper language, isolated from the cultural life of the Czechs, a language without a people. He utilizes this language to pursue a paralinguistic style capable of capturing a kind of social body beyond conventional discourse. Without access to such a social code, this body can do nothing but cry and bark and emit the inarticulate noise of animals. Kafka's writing thus presents us with a kind of people without a language. Modes of collective embodiment which cannot be categorized according to any available social discourse. When Deleuze writes that health as literature, as writing, consists in, quote, inventing a people who are missing,